Okay, the goal of this video will be to provide a brief introduction to political philosophy by reflecting on one answer to the question, how do we create just political institutions? So like ethics, political philosophy is going to have both a descriptive and prescriptive component. The descriptive parts of ethics involve thinking about or trying to identify the sources of ethics. So does ethics come from religion or from evolution or from culture? And then also thinking about the meaning of ethical judgments, like are ethical judgments objective or subjective? Are they just a matter of taste or opinion? To contrast, the prescriptive aspects of ethics involve saying what ought to be the case. So regardless of what people currently think, what ought they think? What principles should they follow when they're trying to decide what they ought to do? And, specific practical questions we can make prescriptions about, like whether persons should be free to ride motorcycles without helmets. Our answer to that will be prescriptive because it'll be trying to prescribe a specific vision of ethics. The descriptive aspects of political philosophy involve descriptions of what political institutions are, like what are their nature, and how they form. So where do political institutions come from? The prescriptive aspects of political philosophy involve describing what just political arrangements look like. So when we're doing prescriptive political philosophy, we're thinking about what ideal political societies would look like, what principles they would embody, what institutions would make them function. So central to work in political philosophy and this video are the ideas of justice and institutions. Those are major concepts that play an important role in the literature of political philosophy. So there's a significant debate in philosophy regarding just what justice is. So this is not a final answer, of course, but we can generally say that justice signifies a certain set of values like fairness or impartiality or maybe equality. So we can describe political institutions by using the idea of justice. For example, institutions are impartial if they don't utilize a person's identity to either favor them or disadvantage them. And institutions achieve equality if most people have the same opportunities, or if most people have the same outcomes, like health outcomes or economic outcomes. These are ways we think about political institutions, and in thinking about them, we're thinking about whether they're just. Institutions are the laws, norms, rules, and structures of power that constrain the behavior of citizens and distribute the benefits and burdens of social cooperation. So institutions are a broad set of ideas, a broad set of political concepts like taxation, punishment, the structures of power like the legislative branch or the executive branch, rights and entitlements like welfare programs. These are all institutions, and we can evaluate whether or not they're just. The institutions are what make society function one way rather than another. So we're going to be focusing here on John Rawls, who is definitely one of the most important political philosophers of the history of philosophy and certainly of the last century. And according to John Rawls, justice is the primary benchmark by which we evaluate political institutions. So a benchmark is just a metric by which we evaluate any given thing. So when we evaluate, let's say, an institution, we can evaluate it along a variety of benchmarks. So we can ask, is the policy efficient? Is it expedient? Is it cost effective? And is it just? So we might ask that question, for example, about a form of punishment. If we're thinking about punishment, we're thinking about what punishment does. Maybe we think that punishment ought to deter crime. And if we think that, then we're going to ask, is this form of punishment expedient? Is it efficient? Does it achieve the goals we state? We might also ask of of a form of punishment, is it cost effective? So if we're thinking about punishment, we might say, well, what is it costing the taxpayers to, for example, lock millions of people up every year? And then we might also ask of any institution of punishment whether it's just. So we might then be asking, is it fair? Is it equal? Is it impartial? Rawls thinks it's the primary benchmark in the sense that justice should trump other considerations. So if we're considering a specific political institution, like justice, like let's say punishment, he thinks justice should trump considerations of efficiency, expediency, and cost. So when we are evaluating punishment, our considerations about whether that form of punishment is just are more important than considerations about the cost or the effectiveness. And it follows, on Rawls' view, that an efficient and cost-effective but unjust social institution can't be justified because justice trumps these other considerations. So in his book, A Theory of Justice, John Rawls sets out to provide an account of just political institutions. So he's going to give us his view of ideal political arrangements. He's going to articulate what the just institutions would look like. And he's going to arrive at conclusions about what the just political institutions would look like by employing an innovative version of social contract theory. So in order to understand Rawls's view, we need to understand what social contract theory is. Social contract theory is the view that consent justifies political authority. So social contract theorists think about where political authority comes from. Where do political institutions get their justification? How can they exert such force over people? For the social contract theorist, it's consent that does the work. Consent you can view as the permission of government authority to apply to you. So if I consent to political authority, I'm saying the force that the system of governments has can apply to me. I agree to it. And typically when people consent to political authority, they're getting something in return, like security or welfare or social cooperation. So social contract theorists think about where political legitimacy or political authority comes from, and they think it comes from consent. So they say that it's legitimate when it results from an agreement between individuals who consent to have this political authority apply to them. Typically, social contract theorists make arguments about why consent is important by creating thought experiments about the origins of political society. And so when these original political societies arise, they arise, according to the social contract theorists, through a consent between free and equal persons. They consent to specific arrangements of political society that they all agree are fair and right. So the thought experiment that social contract theorists use asks us to imagine, let's say, a time before the establishment of political institutions, when people lived in the so-called state of nature. So here you can imagine people living in the forests or the woods or the deserts, and there's no overarching or hierarchical political structure that would produce and enforce laws, norms, and rules that would constrain their behavior. So in the state of nature, people are naturally free. So we imagine people before political society. This is typically referred to as the state of nature, or the original position. Thinking through this thought experiment, this social contract theory thought experiment, forces us to consider two interrelated questions. First, it forces us to reflect on the fundamental nature of humanity. I think this is a really crucial aspect of social contract theory. Because if we imagine people who live independent of a political authority, we're imagining people who live without laws, norms, and rules that'll govern their behavior and that enforce punishments if they fail to achieve those laws, norms, or rules. So we're imagining people without the threat of punishment. Imagining people like this helps us to reflect on the question whether they're naturally good. After all, if persons are naturally good, they would be inclined to treat others well, regardless of the potential threat of punishment. Here, I'd like to think about this thought experiment in today's society by imagining highways with no police officers. So imagine all of the rules of the road, maybe they exist, but there's no police officers to enforce them. The question is, would people speed more if there weren't any police officers to enforce the rules of the road? If you think that people would continue to drive safely or drive a specific speed limit, regardless of enforcement, then you might say, well, people are naturally good because they're naturally inclined to do what's right or what's beneficial for all. To contrast, if you think that people would be more likely to speed because there was no threat of punishment, then that might say something about our nature. So we can reflect then more generally. If people had no laws, rules, or norms, and no threat of punishment, how would they treat each other? Would they respect each other, or would they violate each other? On reflecting on that question, we're reflecting on the fundamental nature of humanity, what people are like outside of society. And, of course, contract theorists are going to offer different views regarding the fundamental nature of humanity. So Thomas Hobbes, for example, argues that in the state of nature, life is basically warlike. And life is warlike because people are governed by what he calls the passions of preservation, of conquest, and of reputation. So this makes people inclined to harm others. It inclines them towards defense, and then aggression, and then violence. And John Locke has a different view. He says in the state of nature, people are governed by what he calls the law of nature, which inclines us to respect each person as a product of God. And so he thinks even in the state of nature, we'd have some natural inclination to respect one another. So again, there's different views about the fundamental nature of humanity, and Rawls is going to have his own view as well. So the other really important aspect of social contract theory in the thought experiment is that it asks us to imagine what kinds of political institutions people who are living in the state of nature would consent to. In other words, imagining people without a system of governments, we might wonder, well, what kinds of political institutions would they be motivated to accept? What would the transition from the state of nature to society be like? And are there important lessons about the political institutions those people would design? So this forces a set of interrelated questions. What kind of considerations would these people view as important? And this would be directly related to their fundamental nature. So if we think people are self-interested, then we might say that they'll be motivated by considerations of self-interest. So they'll want political institutions which protect their self-interest. On the other hand, if we think that people are naturally benevolent and altruistic, such that they're good and that they are inclined to help others, then they'd be motivated by a different set of considerations, and therefore they might select a different set of political institutions. Maybe they would focus on political institutions that are egalitarian in nature, which is to say they provide the same benefits to all persons, or they count each person's welfare equally. Relatedly, what would motivate them to give up their natural freedom and be constrained by a system of government? So, supposing people in the state of nature are free to do as they wish, what would motivate them to sign up for a system of governance that constrains them? And that might be related to this next question. What problems would they want a system of governments to solve? Here we might reflect on the benefits of social cooperation that are entailed by governments. By having laws, rules, and norms, we get all sorts of systems of trade, of commerce, of travel, of science, and these things are all beneficial. And they may outweigh the benefits of having natural freedoms that you would possess in the state of nature. How does our view about the basic nature of humanity impact our judgments about what political institutions these contractors would select? So what's the relationship between our view of persons and what they're fundamentally like and the institutions we need to have in order to set those kinds of people up for success and cooperation? Okay, So John Rawls is going to offer his own version of the state of nature social contract thought experiment. He calls it the original position. So the original position is the thought experiment involving contractors. These are the people who are going to agree, coming to an agreement regarding the institutions that will govern their new society. So Rawls has two major contributions. So two important ideas come out of this original position. The first is his style of original position. So he creates a novel thought experiment with important new details that he thinks will get us good results, that will be illuminating for what constitutes a just or fair political system. His other major contribution is the articulation of the principles of justice he thinks would be selected in his version of the original position. So there's really two major steps in his work. First is his articulation of the state of nature of the original position that people find themselves in as they move to a civil society, as they enter an agreement about which political institutions will govern them. And then second is his vision of what those people would, in fact, select as principles of justice that would govern the society that they live in. So we have his methodology, his version of the original thought experiment, and then we have his results, what he thinks people in his original position would decide as principles of justice. All right, so here's a basic summary of his methodology. So this is his version of the original position. So according to Rawls, we need to imagine the contractors, i.e. the people who are agreeing to the political society, arriving at an agreement regarding political institutions, but behind what he calls a veil of ignorance. So this is his novel detail. This is his wrinkle on the original position. He says, behind a veil of ignorance, the contractors who are going to enter into the society lack specific knowledge about their own identities. So they're thinking about what kind of society they want to enter, but they don't know the specific details about their own identities. That's why they're behind a veil of ignorance. Specifically, he says, they're ignorant about their place in society, so they don't know what they'll be doing in society. And they don't know their social standing. They don't know their class, maybe their religion, their wealth, their roles. They don't know their natural abilities and talents. They don't know what they're good at, bad at. They don't know what their skills are. They don't know what they excel at. And they don't know their own conception of the good life. So they don't know whether they'll be following a specific religion or they'll have a specific way of life that they'll intend to live. Okay, so here it's really important to stress, Rawls is using this as a thought experiment. He's not saying it's literally possible for there to be people who lack knowledge about their own identities. He's not saying that. He wants us, as people doing the work of philosophy, to imagine people who lack knowledge about their own identities. So we want to imagine these people behind the veil of ignorance. People who are living in the state of nature and who want to enter into a civil society. They want to arrive at an agreement about the political institutions that will govern them. And they do so, says Rawls, behind a veil of ignorance. So we imagine these people lacking certain bits of information about their own identity. Rawls thinks that this is going to be crucial for helping us arrive at political institutions that'll be, in fact, just or fair. Here you might pause the video and ask yourself, why would this lack of knowledge about identity be important as a thought experiment for helping us select just or fair political institutions? So maybe reflect on that a minute before you move forward. All right. So behind the veil of ignorance, the contractors lack knowledge about the kinds of people they'll be once they're in society. So they don't know what their social standing is. They don't know what they'll be good at. They don't know what religion they'll follow. So, for example, they don't know whether they'll be naturally talented at business, or on the other hand, whether they'll find themselves at the bottom of the business hierarchy. Rawls argues that imagining contractors behind a veil of ignorance in this way will help us, as people doing philosophy, formulate just political institutions or fair political institutions. He thinks this because as a result of the contractors not knowing their place in society, they're going to be prevented from formulating laws, norms, and rules that benefit some at the expense of others. In other words, if I am signing up for a new society, but I know that I'm very naturally talented at business, then I might want to formulate political institutions that favor business persons, that favor the business economy, right? Because I know I'll benefit from those. And that might, in itself, tilt the scales such that I benefit more than others by the society that we're agreeing to. But if I don't know if I'm going to be really good or bad at business, then I'll want political institutions that are roughly indifferent about that treat all people equally, that don't favor business persons against non-business persons, that don't favor the CEOs against the entry-level employees. In other words, I'll be conservative about which political institutions I select because I don't know how they'll impact me, and I'll want to be sure that I am not harmed by them. So according to Rawls, this is the result of the contractors having a specific fundamental nature. He describes the contractors, i.e. those people entering into this agreement, as rationally self-interested. So he thinks they're going to be motivated to enhance their own well-being, but they're rational about how to achieve this goal, so they've thought it through. They're not selfish, but they want to enhance their well-being. They want to be more well-off in the society than they would be in the state of nature. So they want the political institutions they agree to benefit them more than remaining in the state of nature would benefit them. And this is really the punchline about the veil of ignorance. As people who are rationally self-interested, i.e. concerned with their own well-being, and as people behind a veil of ignorance, they'll be conservative. They'll aim to formulate political institutions that benefit all persons, regardless of their place in society. So the conservative, rationally self-interested person behind the veil of ignorance will say, I don't know who I'm going to be in society, so I better select political institutions that treat all people equally and fairly, because I might be at the bottom of society, and I want to benefit by that society more than I benefit by being in the state of nature. So the veil of ignorance prevents the contractors in the thought experiment from selecting political institutions that benefit some and harm others. Okay, so that's his methodology. Now, Rawls thinks that behind the veil of ignorance, the contractors would select two principles of justice that would, let's say, constrain the political society that they develop. So he thinks the original position thought experiment would lead to the acceptance of two broad and general principles of justice. And these are the two principles of justice. First, each person is entitled to an equivalent set of rights and liberties. And second, that inequality is only justified if it benefits the least well-off in society. Okay, those are the two principles. Now I'm going to elaborate what he means by each. So first says that each person is entitled to an equivalent set of rights and liberties. This reflects the general idea that all persons should be treated equally. And remember, the contractors are rationally self-interested. So they don't know who they'll be as a result of the veil of ignorance. So they'll want to ensure that each person has the same rights and liberties. They won't want to give certain rights and liberties to some and exclude others, because they don't know where they'll be. So they don't know if they'll get the rights and liberties or will be excluded. So they'll want the rights and liberties to apply evenly or equally to all persons. And that's what he means by there being an equivalent set. He thinks that no person would want more or less than any other, because again, they don't know where they're going to be, so they're going to want to make sure that they receive the equivalent set regardless of their identity, regardless of their natural talents and abilities, regardless of their conception of the good life, regardless of their class or place in society. And I think this captures the idea that the contractors who are creating this civil society would wish to maintain as many of their natural freedoms as possible. Because remember, in the state of nature, they're perfectly free. They can do whatever they want. So entering the civil society, they'll want to keep as many of the freedoms as they can while benefiting from the goods of social cooperation. The second principle of justice says that inequality is only justified if it benefits the least well-off in society. So the second principle of justice is thought to be the more controversial of the two. Most people agree with the idea that each person should have an equal set of rights and liberties. And most people agree that people entering a society would want a society that says that. So social contract theorists tend to agree with the first principle. It's a fairly intuitive idea. But this is a little bit more controversial because it's going to limit the amount of an inequality that can occur. Because an inequality that doesn't benefit the least well-off in the society won't be justified. So we need to think about what he means by inequality that benefits the least well-off. So, firstly, this principle doesn't prohibit inequality altogether. And so it protects some naturally occurring inequality. Once a society is set up, certain people are going to be more talented and skilled than others. And they're going to use those talents to accrue more resources. Rawls is not saying that that's bad in itself. But he is saying that the inequalities that occur should in general benefit all of society. So what do I mean by that? Imagine a doctor, for example, who goes to med school and takes out, $100,000, $200,000 in debt and does all the very hard work of becoming a doctor and then starts to become a doctor. They open their practice and they start making a lot of money. And they're very profitable and they become wealthy. We might say that that inequality is justified because we all benefit from living in a society where there are well-trained and knowledgeable doctors. In other words, if I get injured, I'm going to want for there to be a qualified doctor. And part of what motivates people to be qualified doctors is the profit motive or the wage that they accrue by being a knowledgeable and excellent doctor. So in that sense, that inequality, the fact that doctors make more than other people, is justified because all people in the society benefit from their being well-trained doctors. Still, the principle is going to prevent excessive inequalities that thwart the well-being of the rest of society. So here we should imagine instances of inequality that have no justification in terms of the well-being of the rest of the people who live in the society. So you might think about here the billionaires of society who have so much wealth that we can't any longer explain why them having that much wealth benefits the rest of us. That kind of inequality wouldn't be justified. However, and here is a real complication for Rawls' view, he says attempts to reduce inequality, so attempts to observe this second principle, cannot violate rights and liberties enforced by the first principle. This is a wrinkle because it really prevents us from attacking inequality. After all, attempts to reduce inequality might violate rights and liberties of persons. In other words, if a person is accruing a lot of wealth, but they're doing so as the result of their natural right to participate in an economy or do what they can with their bodies, then thwarting their accrual of wealth in order to reduce inequality would, as a result, violate their natural right and liberty. So there's a lot of controversy in the secondary literature about Rawls as to whether he can actually reconcile these two principles of justice in the way he says he can. In other words, he thinks this second principle is important, that inequality is only justified if it benefits the least well-off, but attempts to reduce inequality seemingly always violate the rights and liberties of the people who accrue the wealth, and so it'll only be in instances where the accrual of wealth occurs as the result of maybe corruption or unethical behavior. Since we don't have a right to corruption or unethical behavior, the second principle might justify limiting inequality, so reducing a particular person's accrual of wealth. All right, I do recommend maybe rewinding here and spending a little bit more time on each principle, thinking about the relationship, and thinking about whether the second principle can be adequately enforced or whether the first principle prevents the enforcement of the second principle. All right, to review, Rawls employs traditional social contract thinking. So he's going to use the thought experiment of people in the state of nature or in the original position trying to arrive at political arrangements that they'll agree to freely. And typically this means that the political arrangements have to benefit them more than the benefits they have of living in a state of nature where they're free to do whatever they want. For Rawls, in his original position, the contractors are crucially behind a veil of ignorance about their place in society. And because of this ignorance, he says they're going to aim to select principles of justice that benefit all persons. After all, he says, they're rationally self-interested. They want to preserve themselves, and they're rational about how to do so. They're not selfish, but they are inclined to protect themselves first. Rawls thinks that in the state of nature, exiting the state of nature in order to form a civil society, behind a veil of ignorance, the rationally self-interested contractors would select two principles of justice that they would utilize in order to evaluate the social and political institutions that govern society. So the first says that each person is entitled to a specific set of rights and liberties. We have certain freedoms that we're entitled to, and each person is entitled to the same set. And then second, inequality can only be justified if it's beneficial to the least well-off. So here, the inequality has to raise up all of society. And instances where inequality fails to do so might not be justified. Because, after all, excessive accruals of a finite resource may leave all persons less well off.